favorites. So, brothers and sisters, our New Testament reading today is from the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verses 14 to 30. What's that? I think the Holy Spirit's moving in. That's what it is, definitely. Okay, so the text says, "For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of the slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours.' But his master replied, 'You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So this is a story, as you know, it's really all about what to do with what you've got. And it's all about talents, not talents in the sense, of course, of your ability to play a musical instrument or some sort of talent like that, but talents as in a measure of precious metals, hence the picture of all the gold. And really, what you do with what you've got is a question that's a subset of questions that fall underneath the big one, which is, how will we live out the Great Commandment? How will we love God with all that we are and all that we have? And how will we love others as much as we love ourselves? What you do with what you've got fits into that sort of subcategory there. And we've talked about trying to answer that by thinking about the biblical narrative really is an invitation. It's like a party invitation. It's an invitation to join your life to God's great story. And that means, if we think about it, we've got one life to live, we get to choose the path, we get to choose our allegiance, and that pathway is full of choices between kingdom decisions and empire decisions. And we'll see that that's true in this parable as well. Now, there's a majority reading of this parable. You may have heard this reading if you've ever heard this parable talked about in some other church. I have heard it talked about in other churches by preachers, and their basic message is summed up here. That what that story is about is that God gives each of us certain talents, and we're to use these talents to build up or increase God's kingdom. And when we do that, God is very happy with us. And when we don't do that, God becomes incredibly angry with us. And they'll say that this is what that parable is about. That's what I would call the majority reading. It's the commonest reading of this parable. In my opinion, it suffers with the disadvantage of being completely wrong. Nonetheless, you could decide for yourself. You might like the majority reading, but I don't for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that in the majority reading, what happens is you cast the slave owner is really kind of cast like God, the powerful one here. And we're told that he goes away in the story, gives the talents to people, and then he leaves. So God is cast as an absentee landlord. And that doesn't fit with my understanding of the nature of God at all, or with the nature of God as it's described in the rest of the biblical narrative. And in fact, as we've seen before, at the time of Jesus, absentee landlords were typically the rich and powerful, often the Romans, who came in and they took over pieces of land, they put everybody to work doing things, and then they left. They went on to Rome. It was like the center of the universe as far as they were concerned. They were loathed by the Jewish people. It doesn't sound much like God, I don't think. In fact, it stands in sharp contrast to the passage that Sabrina read for us from the psalmist here, where the psalmist says that in Judah, God is known, God's name is great. In Israel, God's abode has been established. In Salem, God's dwelling place in Zion. So God is there, right? That's basically what that says. God is there, not that God handed out some talents and then whipped off somewhere else. God is definitively there with the people of God. So in the story, what we read is it starts off sort of reasonable enough. Two of the slaves trade with the talents that were entrusted to them. They make more talents on top of that. Doesn't sound too unreasonable. And we're told that the slave master's reaction is mostly complimentary. It sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Nothing wrong with that. But then you get to the last slave here. And the landowner, remember, who's cast as God in this majority reading, is described by the third slave as being harsh, somebody who reaps where he doesn't sow, who gathers where he doesn't scatter seed, and who causes his slaves to be afraid. None of that sounds like God, so that's a problem. And the landowner, cast as God, scolds the third slave and says this: "You ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return, I would have received what was my own with interest." Now, that's a huge problem if this character is supposed to represent God, because if you go back and you look, say, in Exodus 22, you'll find it says, if you lend money to people, to the poor especially, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. Exacting interest is very, very much frowned upon. Indeed, in Leviticus 25, it talks about do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from loaning things, but fear God. You shall not lend your money at interest taken in advance or provide food and other things at a profit. You're not allowed to do this. It's exploitation according to Old Testament law. And the prophets, they had very harsh words for people who charge interest. You know, it's a way of impoverishing people, right? Just think today about like credit card interest, for example. You want to impoverish somebody, that's how you do it. So in Ezekiel 18, it talks about people oppressing the poor and needy, taking advances or accrued interest. And what should happen to somebody like that? Shall he then live? He shall not, says Ezekiel. He has done all these abominable things. He shall surely die. His blood shall be upon himself. And that's about as negative as it gets, right? This practice of getting interest from people. And yet the character in the story, cast as God in the majority reading, does just that. So that's a problem. That can't be right, can it? And then there's this extraordinary thing that the landowner says. Just ponder on this for a minute. See if this resonates with anything in the world today. But to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Now that sounds absolutely nothing like the message of the biblical narrative. And in fact, it stands in direct opposition to the words of Jesus. So that's a problem. Because, if you think about that idea that all those who have, more will be given and they will have an abundance. And yet in Luke 12, Jesus says, from everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. Jesus' teaching is the exact opposite, isn't it? So, this majority reading of the parable of the talents, sort of simple reading, God gives each of us certain talents. We're to use them to build up the kingdom. God loves it when you do that and hates it when you doesn't, is a huge problem. And in my opinion, it can't possibly be what Jesus was actually talking about. So what was he actually talking about? So then we have a minority reading here. So not nearly as popular, but it's the one that I have. You can feel free to disagree with me. It's perfectly okay to do that. But I would say in this story, the absentee landlord represents the Roman Empire. The two slaves who trade with the talents on behalf then of the Roman Empire, those are people who are colluding with the empire. They're making a profit for the empire. And it's the third slave, the one who refuses to collude with the empire. He's actually the hero of this story. He's the one who says, no, I won't do it. So it's actually the empire then that makes this extraordinary proclamation, which is something we see in the world today. That all those who have, more will be given and they will have an abundance. You have surely read about people in wherever you get your news from who during the period of the pandemic, their net worth increased by billions and billions of dollars, right? To those who have, more will be given, they will have an abundance. And you also know a lot of people who maybe lost their jobs and couldn't pay their rent or their mortgage, lost their home, so on and so forth. From those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. That's not a kingdom message, that's an empire message. And what does the empire do to those who refuse to collude with the empire and build up even more profit for the empire? Throw them into the outer darkness. And then in the kingdom, seeing people being thrown into the outer darkness, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's how I would read this parable. It's a kingdom empire parable. Here, the hero is the one who won't collude. Now, the parable attempts to make this really obvious to the listener by talking about various units of money. We've talked about some of this before, so if you remember all of this, just bear with me for a moment. In case you don't, when we're talking about talents, remember that's a measure that's used for precious metals like gold and silver, and a talent weighs something like 75 pounds. People argue about this all the time, so you'll see different numbers, but very rough. So just imagine 75 pounds of gold, what that would look like. So that's one talent. And one talent corresponded to 6,000 denarii, and one denarius There's a worker's wages for 1 day. So if you do the arithmetic on all of that, if a talent is 6,000 days' wages for a labourer, 2 talents, which is what one of the people got, 12,000 days, 5 talents, 30,000 days. So you can turn that into years. If you think of 6 days a week, Jewish, so 6 days a week is good, 52 weeks a year, do the arithmetic on that. 1 talent is what you could earn in about 19 to 20 years, 2 talents, double that, 5 talents coming on for 100 years. So you just round it off and it looks like this. 20 years wages, 40 years wages, 100 years wages. In other words, these are massive amounts of money to those hearing the words of Jesus. There's not pocket change that we're talking about. This is really significant stuff here. And the hero of the day is the person who refused to use an amount approximating 20 years' income in collusion with the empire. He just wouldn't do it. The others were willing to profit the empire with amounts so huge that no ordinary person would ever be able to amass such a sum of money. Gigantic amounts of money, in other words, that the empire benefited from, except for from the one person who said, I won't do it. So we go all the way back to the beginning. You'll recall as we talked about the idea of loving God with all that you are and all that you have, and loving your neighbor as yourself, and think of it as a journey along a pathway. The journey lasts as long as your life does. You get to choose your allegiance through every decision you make between kingdom and empire. And there are many of these decisions here. So the message of the parable really is you can work as a slave to benefit the empire if you want to. You can make that choice. Or you can make a choice to stand apart and side with the kingdom. And remember the creed of the empire before you make a decision. The creed of the empire is that to all those who have, more will be given and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. That's the message of the empire. And it's written loud and clear. So, just as an example, coming up soon, we have a whole array of opportunities to think about what we do with what we've got. And it's Black Friday, Cyber Monday, there'll be Christmas shopping, post-Christmas sales, all of that stuff is going to happen, right? It's going to roll out over the next couple of months. And if you think about what this says about how we think about something like Christmas here, the story is an incredibly messy, untidy story in which this young couple shows up. They wind up in a barn or a cave or something like this with animals roaming around and straw, and animal waste. And it's just a horrible mess, isn't it? It's a very, very messy story of Christmas. And somehow we've managed to turn it into this other picture down here, which is where you have, I don't know how many gifts there are by that Christmas tree. There's a lot, right? An abundance of stuff is sitting there like that. So if you look at Christmas spending in the US, this graph, I know the print is small, so you can't see it, but it starts off down here, and it's basically a straight line upwards, and that's from 2002 to 2021. And 2022 would be a bit higher up here. And the last number on there, 2021, is $800-something billion. It's not million, $billion. And there's a chance some people are very, very excited in the empire because they think this year it might actually make it up to $1 trillion. $1 trillion? Remember, I said that these stories about the empire, they're told using amounts of money that are so huge you can't wrap your head around. That's what happens in the parable. And that's the same with this graph. You see the line going up and you think, oh, that's interesting. And you say trillion, you think, I can't really picture that. You can't picture it because it's so enormous. Enormous. And that's going to be Christmas spending. That's just in the US. That's not across the rest of the globe. And if you parcel that out per family or per individual, the estimate for this year, there's a link from the people who study all of this, the US households will spend on average a little over $1,500 during the holiday season. Maybe you're in a position where $1,500 doesn't sound like a lot of money to you. But I promise you that there are a lot of people to whom $1,500 is an unimaginably huge amount of money to be able to spend at Christmas. And because of that, they will be tempted to go borrow credit card. Yeah. 22% of Americans think that their Christmas spending are going to leave them in debt. And the people who are lending them the money are not the least interested. In the Old Testament, it says you must not charge interest. They're not the least interested in that, right? And in credit card interest, you might wind up paying 21% something to the same bank that if you put your money in a savings account right now is giving you about 0.1%. So the spread is so huge, it's just absolutely ridiculous. So the question of what you will do with what you've got in the days ahead is very important. You could wind up horribly in debt if you make a certain set of decisions, couldn't you? Now, why is this? Well, it's because the empire has foisted onto us a certain image of Christmas. We want a perfect Christmas. We want lots of gifts for our little children and the beautiful meal and the house decorated with lights on. Don't worry about paying the electric bill. That'll come later. And so on and so forth. It always reminds me that there are some paintings by Norman Rockwell that show this kind of highly idealized American Christmas type of scene here. And we are told it's worth it at any price, even if you have to spend money that you don't have. The empire loves it when you do that. Why? Because of that 21%. That's why. So that's all a big problem, isn't it? Now, the first Christmas, you'll remember, was just this extraordinary mess. This young couple, they were just in a horrible situation. They got nowhere to go. It was just about to give birth to a baby, and they end up in a stable or a cave or something like a barn. Who knows what it really was. It was a mess, just like life can get to be a mess today. And the message of Christmas is that in the middle of that mess, God shows up and brings hope and joy. And people can smile because they see the little baby. That's basically the message, right? God shows up. God is not an absentee person, an absentee landlord. God shows up in the middle of the mess. Now, if you want to be really challenged this Christmas about what you do with what you've got, and I'm talking seriously challenged here, there's a book called Christmas is Not Your Birthday. And it's written by Mike Slaughter, who some of us know, Mike, a little bit. He was a United Methodist. He was pastor until he retired of a church in Ginghamsburg, Ohio. It was the biggest United Methodist church in Ohio. Huge, great big place there. And Mike does not mince words with people. So sometimes he would give a sermon and he would lose like 2,000 members from his church because he said something people didn't know. And then he'd get up the next Sunday and he'd say it again, but only even more strongly, and then bring in 2,000 new people who wanted to hear it. So he just kept saying what he thought was right. And he points out correctly that Christmas is not your birthday. So why would you expect gifts? It's not your birthday. Whose birthday is it? It's Jesus' birthday. The gifts are supposed to go to the person whose birthday it is, right? Isn't that what happens on birthdays? The person whose birthday it is gets the gift. How do you give a gift to Jesus? I tell you the truth. Whatever you do for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do it for me, says Jesus, telling you how to give a gift to him. You give it to the least of these. And so Mike has this book about that. It won't, if you do have the chance to grab it and read it, I really recommend it. Although I could almost promise it will make you feel incredibly uncomfortable in some places because he minces no words about the subject. What you do with what you've got really matters. Why? Because it's a kingdom versus empire decision. And when you make a decision that colludes with the empire, you go directly against the things that Jesus teaches us to do. For example, in this parable that we just looked at here. So, this Christmas, here's my soft-pedaled version of Mike's Christmas question. How will you live out the Great Commandment? How will you love God with all that you are and all that you have? And how will you love others as much as you love yourselves? Those two questions, I think, are questions to ask every time you're tempted to pull out your wallet. Ask those two questions and then make your decision. It's your decision, of course. You can choose. It's your path and it's your life. Every choice along the path is a kingdom versus empire decision. How will we love God with all that we are and all that we have? How will we love others as much as we love ourselves? And what will that look like at Christmas? Which you will remember is not. Amen.